happy to be here on this eve of Polio Day. Just about, I think it's tomorrow is the Polio Day, but it's very close. And to speak about the contribution, the solo contribution that my sister Robin made during her life. Well, in recognising today the important role of so many healthcare workers during COVID-19, this is a good time to look back on our previous epidemic. And one of our own who made an outstanding solo contribution to dispense polio vaccine to Western Australia's outback regions. That first photograph was Robin in the middle with two of her sisters, one of them being me. It's no easy task to summarise the life of my sister Robin, or even a part of it. As recorded in her diligently kept diary, any day was crammed with drama of the sort most people might encounter only once in a lifetime. Robin was the daughter, one of 6 children of the author Mary Durack and the air pioneer Crawley Millett, who founded MMA, an air service covering WA and the Northern Territory. I don't know if there's anybody here now who ever flew on MMA, but it was our local duty. Yes, and it was a very well-known airline at that time in the up until about the 1980s, when it was taken over by ANZAC. The family connection with the North began with a cattle trek across the continent from Queensland to the Northern Territory in 1883, which saw the establishment of the Durack Pastoral Company in the East Kimberley region. And that was well covered in a history written by my mother called Kings in Grass Castles. Born in 1940, Robin was educated at Loretto Convent, situated a short distance from where we lived in Nedlands, an address I still hold today. Holidays were spent in Broome, where our family had a second home, purchased after the war when the town was fairly derelict and still displaying the damage from Japanese bombing. When the Durack pastoral stations were sold in 1950, this Broome-style bungalow became our last remaining base in the north. That's a photograph of Robin taken with her parents and the 4 members of the family at that time, which expanded to 6. From an early age, Robin took a keen interest in all things aeronautical. The deadly 9-hour DC-3 trip on which we all travelled to and from Broome was for her full of interest. As a special treat, the pilots let her sit in the cockpit jump seat for most of the way. And by the age of 10, she could run through the takeoff and landing procedure like a pro, not missing a single item on the checklist. Her favourite activity in Broome was going on flights with her father in his Australian-designed and built Wacket Trainer. This aircraft today is preserved and on display in the Bull Creek Aviation Museum. Another bonus that came with being the daughter of Crawley Millett was that she was allowed to go around on the DC-3 Kimberley station run, some 10 to 14 ports of call in short order, plus heat, turbulence and flies. You really had to be keen to voluntarily subject yourself to this ordeal, I can tell you. A clever and diligent student at school, with her sensible personality and popularity, Robin was an obvious choice for the position of head girl. All her life she would be the obvious choice for almost any role of responsibility, as if she ever needed extra obligations. While she really wanted a job in aviation more than anything else, because there was no employment to be had for female pilots, when Robin left school she decided to take up nursing, involving 3 years training at Royal Perth Hospital. Her father agreed that this was a sensible course, as in his opinion there was no place for women in commercial aviation. It was very much a man's preserve. Without discussing the matter further, Robin quietly investigated the cost of flying lessons. £10 an hour, pre-decimal, was £2 more than her weekly salary as a student nurse, so she would only manage to pay for 1 hour per fortnight, but she reckoned it was doable. And so on top of the rigorous demands of her nurses training and her duties as inevitably the president of the Student Nurses Association, was added the not insignificant study towards gaining a private pilot's licence, including passing the dreaded Morse code test. And I'll never forget that awful noise of the beep, 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 coming out of Robin's room all through the night as she, a totally redundant means of communication that was then still a requirement, can you believe? By 1962, with her usual tenacity and determination, Robin gained her PPL and in the same year not only graduated as a registered nurse but took off the Nurses Medical Prize. There's her graduation day, and here she is receiving the prize. It was her belief that if she could find the means to obtain a commercial pilot's licence, she would be then able to put her combined experience to practical purpose. As luck would have it, at this time, a limited number of Commonwealth scholarships for study and training to CPL standard was offered in Australia. Having convinced the interview board that she was what they were definitely looking for, Robin became one of 6 to receive that scholarship, and with her target in sight, she began her training, the only female in a class of 30. It would be 4 years of strenuous application, but by 1966 all exams had been passed. She was a triple certificate nurse and the proud holder of a CPL. There she is planning a flight. Her first passenger was her father, who was by now full of pride and completely reconciled to his daughter taking up a flying career in one form or another. In fact, he had somehow convinced himself that it had always been his idea. Although he was still a registered pilot, his licence was the longest held in Australia. His old Wacket aircraft had lost its C of A, that's its pilots here will know, certificate of airworthiness, and he knew his flying days were coming to an end. Robin's exploits would give him a new lease of life. Always keeping in close touch with the North, Robin had for some time been aware of many remote areas that had been left out of the polio immunisation program. From what she had seen, there was also a situation of general neglect in Aboriginal communities that needed to be addressed. With this in mind, she began to devise a way to offer her services to the Department of Health. Maths, never her strongest subject, she laboured over the economics of a proposal that could be taken to the Commissioner of Health, Dr. Davidson. As it happened, her approach came at a time when the state was faced with a threatened second epidemic of polio. In order to immunise an estimated 30,000 people scattered over 500,000 square miles, a plan to make use of caravan clinics was being considered by the department. Knowing that this would be a slow process while lives were being lost, Robin came back with an offer to provide the government with a speedy, bargain price alternative. She would do the job single-handed at a fraction of the cost, and she would supply her own aircraft. It was certainly a tempting offer that would solve their problems, but it put the decision-makers in something of a dilemma. There was no doubting her qualifications, but would they be doing the right thing to expect this young girl to undertake such an enormous task alone? Finally, the department decided to give her a go with a cautious agreement to employ her on a trial basis. She never actually found out when her trial came to an end. On receiving her letter of appointment, Robin closed a deal she had been negotiating for some weeks, took out a loan and purchased a second-hand single-engine Cessna 182 for £12,500. At a cost to the government of 20 cents a mile, given the area involved, she figured this could be paid off within the anticipated time frame. She was given 3 weeks to fit out her aircraft, put together an itinerary and publicise her program with advance notices. That is the first aircraft. That is her actual aircraft after she sold it to Williams. Since there was a reluctance among some outback communities when it came to injections, which has already been mentioned, a decision was made to use the Sabine vaccine, which was administered orally rather than the Salk. Medical supplies for the first round consisted of 4 52-pound boxes of sugar lumps on which to administer the raspberry-flavoured vaccine, 8 boxes of plastic spoons, 10 pounds of boiled lollies for the Aboriginal children, never mind their teeth, and a large supply of pamphlets and cards on which to record the names and locations of every person to receive a dose of vaccine. Knowing full well that she would be working in areas where there would be people suffering from a range of medical problems, Robin put in a request for some basic surgical implements, topical ointments and bandages. This was refused with a reminder that she would have to be careful not to overstep her nurse's prerogative. Her job was limited to the polio program. Meanwhile, the areas which fell under her personal responsibility were daunting. She was expected to find serviceable airstrips, make out flight plans from any available information, organise medical supplies, find storage for the vaccine, organise her accommodation and transport to and from the clinic, and see to refuelling requirements and aircraft maintenance and safety. Just to prove it, that's as she's packing up some of her boxes, and here she's putting in a spot of maintenance underneath the aircraft. The last essential, which was to keep her plane safe, saw Robin opting to sleep in the aircraft, which he could not always get into a hangar. If there was a need for a quick move, bad weather or other concerns such as damage to the fuselage by marauding cattle or goats, which once ate into the fiberglass wheel spats of her aircraft. Having seen to the air navigation charges, insurance and radio licence in June 1967, declaring herself utterly broke, up to her neck in debt, but the happiest girl in the world, Robin set out in her Cessna on round 1 of the program. There she is, off she goes. Her first problem was hazardous airstrips, which had been supposedly checked out as safe. Sinkholes, large stones, wandering cattle and other obstructions all seemed to turn up just as she came into land or attempted to take off. That's a typical script that she would be coming into. No part of the job was going to be easy, even the easy parts. Just keeping a record of the names of Aboriginal people proved unexpectedly difficult. Some couldn't remember their name or gave a different name on each visit. There were tribal names, whitefellow names, government names, and now and then they just left it to Robin to suggest something she thought suitable. Associated as she was with sugar lumps and flying, Robin was herself dubbed the Sugarbird Lady, a nickname soon widely taken up and later became one of the titles of her books. During what was perceived as a man's job, she took some trouble to project a feminine image, and avoiding the ubiquitous jeans, she customarily clad her slim figure in light cotton outfits and kept her blonde hair long. The press found her irresistible. Once the vaccine was distributed, as Robin had anticipated, numerous people presented with a variety of medical problems for which she had no equipment. Tetanus was feared more than polio in the northwest. Barefoot children, particularly vulnerable. Many of them had not been immunised against anything. After communication with Perth and the usual red tape, a supply of tetanus vaccine and triple antigen inoculations were sent up to be added to her already heavy load. Infected ears were a commonplace condition. When asked what she could do for a screaming child with a suppurating mass coming from one ear, rather than walk away, Robin removed a pocket of dead flies lodged behind the eardrum with a pair of long-nosed pliers from her tool kit. You'd have to hope she sterilised them first. Perhaps the most distressing complaint was the endemic eye disease trachoma, which caused blindness for the most part among Aboriginal people. Her concern reported to the health department, Robin was advised to do what you can. That amounted to placing a mark beside the name of those worst affected. At her first opportunity, she did something about it, consulting a close friend of our family, who was fortuitously a world-renowned expert on trachoma. Professor Ida Mann would accompany Robin on her second round. Examining the eyes of 600 people, evidence of trachoma was found in 92%. Once fully instructed by Dr. Mann, Robin then set up her own program to counteract the disease. Eye inspections, health talks, slideshows and treatment became an added part of her clinic. By the time of the third Northwest section round, the original program included all those additional aspects of healthcare that Robin could ethically undertake. At the same time, she had to cope with a massive amount of paperwork, along with the meticulous pre-planning and preparation that went into every flight. On this typical day, you can see she made 12 stops, 12 clinics in her flight record book. She kept that every day, the book, and there were many of those. By the end of 1967, 7 months since the start of the program, Robin had covered, warning, statistics coming up, 16,857 nautical miles, held clinics at 31 places, and administered 17,000 doses of Sabine vaccine. Her Cessna at this stage was showing its age, and with some urging from her father, who thought it an unreliable aircraft to fly into rugged Kimberley regions, Robin sold it and purchased a red and white Mooney Super 8. I think that little aircraft that you've been presented with this evening, the little gold lapel badge, is the Mooney. It's possibly the Cessna. The wing is positioned right in the middle, so it's rather hard to tell. The Mooney had a low wing rather than the high wing of the Cessna, and Robin thought it much easier to fly. In an amazing coincidence, its registration was Romeo Echo Mike, and REM were her initials. Anyway, that's the story she gave us. I was never too sure about that. With the wet season delaying her clinics for 4 weeks, never one to put her feet up, Robin undertook to ferry a single-engine Horizon aircraft from Paris to Perth for a French company, a commercial arrangement that made the prospect fairly attractive. And that aircraft can also be seen in the Bull Creek Museum. A week after her return in April 1968, she was off again on the preliminary round of the Kimberley vaccination program, covering 26 main centres before tackling the 50 remote areas consisting mostly of missions, cattle stations, Aboriginal settlements and isolated homesteads, an area of some 283,000 square miles. I always find this a very moving photo. One day someone in another aircraft saw her passing by out there, all alone, somewhere, and took this photo. Here is a typical page from Robin's daily diary, which is packed with information and personal comments. A terrible night spent in Wyndham, an unexpected meeting with her sister Julie, details of flights, clinics and people at Columbaroo and Mount House, and a final stop at Fitzroy Crossing, where on finding the airport deserted, carrying her gear, she had to undertake the long walk into town as darkness fell. That was the end of her day, to have to walk into town after all that. And her steady writing goes on and on, page after page in all those diaries. She was now flying into Kimberley country, familiar to her, including those places that had been pioneered by her Durack relatives. When she reached Argyle station, she was greeted with great excitement by the Aboriginal people who had known her family for many years. On her 3 Kimberley rounds, Robin administered 20,000 doses of Sabine vaccine, plus the uncounted additional immunisations. At the end of October 1968, she handed over to the Public Health Department the many thousands of sorted and collated record cards. I don't know if these cards have been preserved, but I imagine they would today represent a remarkable overview of rural and outback WA as it was 50 years ago. For the remaining 7 years of her life, Robin worked in all her capacities as a flying nurse for the Royal Flying Doctor Service. She made 6 ferry flights across the globe and held executive positions in various women's and women pilots organisations. Always modest, she never sought praise or publicity, and the attention she got from the press was always for her a source of embarrassment. Her life given to community service and caring for others came to an end when she died of cancer in 1975. She worked up to a few weeks before her death, and to the last valiantly kept up her diary. You can see the effort she made on her very last page of all the diaries she wrote. This was the end. She would receive a number of prestigious posthumous awards, and there's a memorial to her at RPH and another at Jandakot Airport. Her final resting place was in her beloved Broome, beside her sister Julie, who predeceased her, where her pilot's wings are attached to her gravestone. Her papers, diaries, photographs and other effects can be found in the National Library in Canberra, where they are accessible if anybody wants to do any research on her. From her journals, 2 books have been written which remain to confound anyone who might think some goals are out of reach or underestimate the difference one person can make. Flying Nurse and Sugarbird Lady are available from most libraries. For anyone interested in a further account of Robin's life, Inseparable Elements, a book about my family written by me, is due to be released in a week or so. And I will end with a short extract from this publication. This is from the book. Regularly bending the rules and fudging duty hours to accommodate every contingency, although her status allowed her some latitude from the not entirely unaware DCA, Robin was on occasions called to account. Coping with emergencies and tragedy that she believed transcended regulations, she confined the true overtime record to her diary. In that vigilantly maintained journal, amid graphic description of injury and illness, can be found a unique insight into the behaviour of patients in circumstances of mortal stress. Drunken abuse, terrified screaming, stoic endurance, frozen fear, and the children, heartbreakingly good even as they died. She noticed that the very elderly and the very young seemed to conduct themselves best in the face of suffering. Men were often fortified by the mere sight of her. A dying prospector, looking with wonder at the vision transporting him on his last journey, finally whispered in his cracked old voice, "By crikey, your parents must be terribly, terribly proud of you." We all were. Thank you very much.